President Myung and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba make public a joint statement, the two countries' first in 17 years following their talks in Tokyo this past weekend. Hope you had a good weekend. It's Monday, August 25th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. South Korea and Japan will work as partners to respond to various concerns facing the global community to promote future-oriented mutual interests. Now, this is according to the leaders of the two countries following their latest talks over in Tokyo this past weekend. For more, I freelance journalist Raphael Rashid here in the studio. Raphael, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Walter Sim with Singaporean daily, the Straits Times, back with us following last Friday's preview of the summit between Seoul and Tokyo. Walter, it's great to have you on again.
Likewise, thanks for the invite.
Right, we will start here in the studio. Raphael, let's begin with details of the joint statement by President Myung and Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba following their talks in Tokyo this past weekend.
Right. The joint statement, I think, was quite a remarkable diplomatic breakthrough, the first of its kind between Seoul and Tokyo in 17 years, as you said. I think what made Saturday's summit particularly significant was that President Lee became the first South Korean leader in the 60-year history of normalized relations between the two countries to choose Japan rather than the United States for his inaugural bilateral overseas visit. The statement itself commits both nations to cooperation across several key areas. Notably, they agreed to collaborate on future industries like hydrogen and artificial intelligence, while also establishing a joint consultative body to deal with shared demographic challenges that the two countries are facing, particularly the low birth rate issue and aging population that the two countries are facing. The two-hour summit also addressed regional security cooperation, including joint efforts towards Korean Peninsula denuclearization and strengthening strategic communications across security and economic realms. And both of the leaders acknowledged the need for kind of an enhanced coordination given the changing strategic environment in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region. When it comes to President Lee, I think he captured the relationships in its essence by describing Korea and Japan as neighbors sharing the same courtyard, emphasizing the need for mutual respect and kind of practical cooperation between the two sides. And I think the personal chemistry was quite evident when Lee remarked that the meeting with Ishiba was the second time that they met, and it felt like close friends. So overall, I think it was quite a positive summit for the two sides, and of course there will be hopefully more future kind of shuttle diplomacy between the two sides. So this was on a big scale, but I think we'll see plenty more to come.
Right, and that being said, Walter, what does this joint statement suggest about the broader strategic vision of both administrations toward each other and, of course, toward their common concerns?
Right. I think Raphael did put it very eloquently about the significance of the summit. The fact that there was a joint statement, the very fact that there is a joint statement is incredible, given that it's the first such document in 17 years. So I do think that it sends a very strong signal of President Yee's focus on pragmatic diplomacy, as he did describe South Korea and Japan, as Raphael said, as neighbors sharing the same courtyard. They are inseparable partners. And of course, Japan is more than willing to reciprocate, given how both countries share a similar strategic vision and as well as similar broader challenges. So I think it definitely is a recognition that it is far more productive to work together to resolve all these issues rather than to squander the warm relationship that both countries currently share by focusing on their disagreements. So such pressing issues run the gamut from trade to security social challenges, as Raphael discussed, and of course, the unpredictability of their joint security ally, the United States. So that being said, and as I briefly talked about earlier, there definitely is still a lot of room for disagreements when both countries do not see eye to eye on history. And I think one point that the Japanese media really picked up on is how, this year is 80 years since the end of Japan's colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula. And that in itself is a lot of fodder for historical angst. But Mr. Lee has set this very forward-looking, very future-oriented direction, including remarks he made to Japan's Yomiuri Shimbun last week of how it would be undesirable to overturn existing agreements. So with that said, the joint statement did note that Mr. Ishiba would inherit the 1998 bilateral joint declaration, which stated Japan's deep remorse and heartfelt apology for the tremendous damage and suffering to South Koreans during colonial rule. But also in that regard, and I thought it was very significant that, President Lee barely mentioned, if at all, historical issues during this visit to Japan, which kind of suggests a very laser-eyed focus on building a cooperative future together with Japan rather than focusing on their fractured past.
Right, and staying with that, Raphael, does this summit, do you suppose, serve to bolster the EJM administration's policy of advancing pragmatic diplomacy?
I think it absolutely does. He has mentioned several times that this pragmatic diplomacy is what he is seeking. And as we previously mentioned, his decision to visit Japan, basically breaking decades of diplomatic protocol, being the first bilateral visit overseas, I think it represents a kind of complete reversal of kind of previous policy, and even from his own past maybe actions or positions when he criticized his predecessor as a puppet for engaging with Tokyo. Yet when we had the Liberation Day just the other day in his speech, days before the summit, President Lee called Japan an indispensable partner for Korea's economic development and prosperity. So again, kind of changing words, but being, I guess, pragmatic or realistic about the way the world works. I think we're seeing Lee's commitment to formally define this pragmatic diplomacy centered on, as he's saying, national interests. So kind of going beyond these kind of ideological divisions and looking at the economy and security first and foremost, maybe a shift away from the past where we'd have values-based diplomacy and whatnot. I think Lee has, in the past, he's explicitly stated that there needs to be kind of they should not be overt antagonism that serves South Korea's national interests, nor should there be an alliance only with Washington. And I think he's basically reflecting the belief that, we should maintain strong ties with the US, but also with Japan and also China. Of course, the timing itself is, I guess, quite telling. By visiting Tokyo before tonight's summit with Trump, I think he is basically saying that his administration won't be confined to the kind of traditional norms or diplomatic hierarchies of the past, and will try to go beyond, well, at least this is what he's trying to portray it as, beyond liberal and conservative policies, and hopefully kind of bridge the divides for maybe more centrist way of doing things, perhaps more sustainable for the future. As we know, whenever we have a change of administration, the pendulum always swings between the two sides and there's no continuity in policy. So I think this is what he's aiming for, and it seems, at least for now, that this is exactly what he's been talking about when it comes to pragmatic diplomacy.
Right. And Walter, you mentioned this earlier. So do tell us a bit more, that is, about how the Japanese media is framing the summit between the two leaders and their prospects of future engagement.
Well, the framing has been extremely positive, and there is a lot of focus on how their meetings, firstly in a smaller setting before a wider bilateral meeting involving more officials lasted a combined nearly 2 hours, and that was apparently, according to Japanese media reports, longer than scheduled. So I do think that there is a lot of focus on their personal chemistry. And just to give a sampling of some of the sentences or some of the statements that's being made in Japanese media. So the Nikkei newspaper in a report pointed out, and I quote, that the outcome represents a break from how South Korea's political left has for decades approached relations with Japan, and this raises the possibility of a long-term change in bilateral relations. The Yomiuri newspaper also said in an editorial that South Korea has, and I quote, clearly conveyed its willingness to advance bilateral relations with Japan, and both countries have gotten off to a good start toward building a new era in their relationship based on mutual understanding. But of course, it's not all positive, and there is still this nagging feeling that, there might be something lurking behind the shadows. So, and I think this wariness stems from how, as was discussed earlier, President Lee was previously hostile towards Japan. So it kind of comes about as a 180-degree change to some commentators here in Japan. And so this kind of raises questions in certain segments of the media of whether Mr. Lee might be tempted to play the Japan card if his popularity weakens for political gain. And of course, that might undo current progress. It was also noted that the joint statement made no mention of the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and that phrasing is a norm basically for joint statements that Japan puts out with other countries. And there's some speculation of whether this could be out of South Korea's desire to avoid unnecessarily provoking China in its delicate balancing act. So there is a lot of acknowledgement, of course, of how the Japan-South Korea bilateral relationship is crucial, especially when considering their trilateral relationship with the United States, given how both are US allies that rely heavily on Washington for their security. So as a form of insurance, I think it was quite intriguing that the Yomiuri actually suggested that both countries go one step further in cementing their defense ties, and sign new defense deals to put past security mishaps like that of 2018 when there was this radar lock-on incident, to put such incidents behind them. So the Yomiuri actually suggested that maybe it's time for Japan and South Korea to consider an AXA agreement, an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement that would kind of allow Japan's self-defense forces and the South Korean military to provide fuel and ammunition to each other, and that would kind of, build bridges between the armed forces of both countries.
Right, to ensure, of course, greater regional defense. Raphael, I'd like to touch upon something you mentioned earlier. You spoke about how the South Korean president sent a delegation to China. Now, this, of course, was his 12th and final delegation to different parts of the world. The delegation to China was led by former National Assembly Speaker Park Byung-seok, and he arrived in China this past Sunday. Could you tell us a bit about the mission of that particular delegation?
Yeah, this marks, it basically completes President Lee's kind of global outreach program since taking office. The four-person team, as you mentioned, was led by former National Assembly Speaker Park Byung-seok, who brings a tremendous amount of China expertise to the table. He's been a six-term lawmaker who previously served as President Moon's special envoy to Beijing in 2017. The delegation was also including two Democratic Party lawmakers known for their China expertise as well, Kim Tae-yeon and Park Jong, and they were also joined by No Jae-hyun, who is the son of former South Korean President Roh Tae-woo. And this kind of family connection, this is the family or the president who brought the 1992 Korea-China diplomatic normalization. So I think it gives him quite a strong standing when it comes to Beijing. And this delegation carried a letter from President Lee, and it's to be conveyed to Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, And I mean, they weren't able to meet with Xi, but instead they were able to meet with the foreign minister and other top diplomatic and legislative leadership. So I think they aimed for maybe second best, and I think that's quite an achievement in itself. Again, the timing of this, I think, is very significant. Their departure, of course, coincided with a China-Korea diplomatic normalization anniversary, and also, of course, strategically bridges between the two summits in Japan and now tonight in the US. And I think this sends a clear message that Seoul won't neglect Beijing while it seeks to have negotiations or talks or strengthening ties with Washington and Tokyo. So kind of doing the three at the same time, essentially. The letter that was delivered to Xi reportedly included an invitation to attend the APEC summit, which is taking place in Gyeongju later in October. President Lee, of course, hopes to secure this kind of first face-to-face interaction meeting with the Chinese leader. And of course, with China that will be hosting APEC next year, I think Xi's attendance seems likely, hopefully. So I think this delegation is kind of crucial groundwork for what could be a pivotal year or pivotal moment in China-Korea relations. And lest we forget, the National Assembly Speaker, Woo Won-sik, is set to attend China's celebration of the end of World War II. And I think it's in next week. So I think, yeah, a big bundle of things happening at the same time. Again, this pragmatic diplomacy seems to be coming out from all corners.
Right. Keeping in mind, of course, the latest developments here in this part of the world, and Walter, does the Trump administration's America First policy, do you think, look to promote a tangible shift toward Northeast Asian regionalism, especially perhaps on the trade front?
Well, I think the question of whether there will be this so-called broader tangible shift is really very much up in the air. And regardless of the Trump administration's America First policy, there is, in fact, trade deals like the RCEP, which basically is a pan-Asia kind of free trade agreement. Of course, there's still a lot of talk of a trilateral free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea, even though that negotiations are still pretty much in the very early stages. But I do think that on trade, there is definitely a lot of room to work together for Japan and South Korea, especially since they share very similar values. And given that Japan is the largest economy in the CPTPP, the 12-nation comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think it would say a lot if Japan takes the initiative and works hard to lobby for South Korea's inclusion, perhaps as its 13th member.
Right. Moving forward, Raphael, President Myung, as you mentioned, and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump are scheduled to sit down at the White House on Monday local time, which would be in the very, very early hours of Tuesday morning Korea Standard Time, of course. What can we expect from this summit?
Yeah, I think President Lee faces a complex agenda, and there's plenty on the table that will be, or hopefully will be, discussed. Building upon July's tariff framework that reduced duties on Korean imports or goods to 15% in exchange for Korea's $350 billion investment commitment. I think the centerpiece discussion will likely focus on this so-called alliance modernization. Trump's team, as we've discussed several times on this program, wants so-called strategic flexibility, allowing forces that are stationed in South Korea to counter not just North Korea, but China, beyond the peninsula, potentially even involving Korea in broader Indo-Pacific contingencies. Speaking aboard his presidential jet on his way to Washington, he acknowledged US demands for this strategic flexibility, but said that they're kind of difficult for us to easily agree to. However, he added that future strategic transformation of the US forces in Korea is necessary, suggesting room potentially for compromise on modernizing the alliance. but perhaps without fully accepting Washington's flexibility demands. Of course, we don't know how Trump will react, and plenty of uncertainty, of course. Also, defense spending, suggestions that Trump wants Korea to increase defense spending from 2.6% to 3.8% of its GDP. So that could be on the table. Higher cost sharing when it comes to the US forces. So I think, and he also mentioned that he'll raise the full range of North Korea issues, emphasizing Korean Peninsula peace as the most important thing for our security. I guess paradoxically, both leaders align on engagement with Kim Jong-un and North Korea, despite their kind of dismissive responses to these overtures over the past few weeks.
Right. Speaking of that, Walter, so South Korea's peace overtures, as Raphael has mentioned, have been largely rebuffed by North Korea. Do you suppose this is a strategic attempt to secure leverage ahead of any tangible cross-border engagements? I mean, what are your takeaways, Walter?
Well, it's really very impossible to pinpoint what exactly the North Korean administration is thinking. But I must say that the world is certainly a very different place now as compared to 2018, when there was the Inter-Korea Summit and there was a lot of positive momentum in inter-Korean relations that paved the way for US-North Korea summits. And why I say so is because I think their strategic chasm is very, very clear. North Korea is squarely aligned with Russia in its war against Ukraine. South Korea has been supporting Ukraine in the war through weapon sales to NATO member states. So I really doubt that, any cross-border engagement is feasible in the near future if the war continues, especially since it kind of exposes how widely divergent their strategic visions are. And we could kind of see evidence of this in how North Korea was very critical of the weekend Japan-South Korea summit, and North Korea's accusing US and its allies of seeking hegemony. And so I really think that North Korea, rather than it being, a strategic gambit, I think it's very much inclined to ignore South Korea's peace overtures at this point.
Right, unfortunately then. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Walter, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Raphael here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.